Hello, everybody. Welcome to day 3 of the Hippodrome Silent Film Festival online edition and to our second live Q&A straight after the screening of Underground. The film you've just seen, I hope, a score composed by Neil Brand, conducted and orchestrated by Timothy Brock, performed by the BBC Symphony Orchestra, co-commissioned by the Barbican and the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and recorded live at the Barbican in 2011. So a little bit of housekeeping at the beginning. This is going to be recorded. Everybody is muted in the audience, and I can't see your hands if you do the raise hands thing at the bottom, but there is, I hope you can see, a Q&A box. And so if you've got any questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and we will we'll get through those as much as we can. And I'd like to now invite our special guests to turn on their cameras. Welcome to Bryony and
Hello.
Welcome to Neil. So I'm just going to introduce you guys. Neil Brand, the composer, as I said, for this afternoon's film, a broadcaster, playwright, TV presenter, and I noticed he's described by Mark Kermode as arguably the country's greatest silent movie score composer. And I don't really know why he prevaricated with the arguably at the beginning there, but we all think of him as Neil Brand off the telly. And we're very honoured to have you here. Bryony Dixon, who is Curator of Silent Film at the BFI National Archive. She is a writer and author of the BFI. I've got this book here. I have it with me all the time. Oh, you can't see it. It's Screen Guide that Bryony wrote for silent film. And Bryony is a programmer of festivals and events worldwide. She's the co-director of the British Silent Film Festival and the lead curator on numerous high-profile restorations, including Underground. And so we're really thrilled to have you here, Bryony. So I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions. I'm going to start with one for Neil, and then we'll take it from there. So Neil, I'm just going to dive straight in to ask you some detail about the score and the film. I think it's fair to say it really treads this tightrope balance between a rom-com and quite a moody thriller. And I wondered what sort of challenge that presented you as a composer, and how you approached that across the score.
I think I always loved the film for that reason. It's a mashup at a time when you didn't normally have those sort of things. So it comes from a place and a director who knows his thrillers, but knows his love stories as well, and is able to make the two work side by side. It helped a lot. I mean, one thing I should mention is that Bryony and I had known and loved this film for probably 15 years or more before we actually got the chance to present it in its proper state. And Bryony will tell you much more about the restoration. I'd known the film and really, really liked it, and loved the fact that you do turn on a sixpence from something very dark and very kind of noirish, and I think literally noirish, lots of shadows and stuff like that, to a really rather beautiful and very lovely love story. And when I'd scored Blackmail, which had been my previous orchestral score, there's nothing like that in there. There's no love, you know, it's a cold, hard arrow to the heart. So I hadn't been able to write a love theme. And when it came to doing Underground, I just thought, right, I am going to write a damn love theme. And the other useful thing was that the orchestra, having commissioned it, they basically said, look, you know, write what you like. You've got to use the whole orchestra. The BBC Symphony Orchestra is unique because all of those players are salaried. So if you don't use them, the money's being spent anyway. So I was in this extraordinary situation, like a Hollywood composer would be, of being told, there you go, best players in the country, off you go. And when I'd done Blackmail, I'd really avoided using piano, because piano can be a prop if you're a piano player. You get piano and then you add stuff to piano, and that's not a great way to score an orchestra, I don't think. Whereas with this, I thought, well, if I'm going to do a love theme, it's got to be piano led, and the piano's got to have a job to do. It's got to be part of the orchestra. So the two things I started with the film were this idea of the piano providing a driving kind of yum bum bum dum bum 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 bum, which is there for the train, it's there for the chase, it's there for the machinery working, it's there whenever we see something kind of unstoppable happening. But it also comes in with single notes playing the love theme. And that is what I particularly was pleased about, being able to introduce that at the kind of meet cute point where the two of them are on the escalators going in opposite directions. That's the first time you hear dee da dee 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 dum, which is then going to become this great big string-led thing when they go off into Epping Forest or wherever it is after their bus trip. And it was that really that allowed me to kind of tread the line between the one and the other. I was also standing on the shoulders of some of my favorite composers, of course. And in one particular instance, Richard Rodney Bennett, and I've never been able to do it before, but my boy and I have started watching Murder on the Orient Express again, and I'd forgotten that he does these wonderful drooping string lines when we see the kidnap at the beginning of Murder on the Orient Express. And it feels deeply evil. There's something wrong about it. So I slipped those in the power station just before, when she's crouched behind the metal door in the power station, when she's about to jump. And that, things like that, I was able to just pull in moments that I'd loved from films in the past and slip them into place with this movie, which was a real kind of, you know, it was a kid in a sweet shop.
I'd love to draw you out more about the themes that you use and the quotes that you make and the references, but I just want to bring up and follow on from something you were saying there about both of your respective love for the film, and to bring in Bryony to talk about the restoration of the film. We should probably start there, because I think you say in your notes or your intro that maybe it had been unshowable for a while, and so it was calling out for work to be done. So do you want to tell us a bit about the restoration?
Yeah, so it had real problems, this print, because it was, for a start, what we call fourth generation. So it was 4 sort of reductions in quality away from the original camera negative. So it was very soft. And it also had a lot of damage in it, which meant it couldn't really be fixed photochemically or photographically. And we really had to wait for the digital age. I mean, we'd been showing it for years, as Neil said, and people just loved it. So it was really one that we wanted to do. And I've got a little clip if anybody would like to see it. Would you like
We'd love
to see
that.
that? Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Forgive me if this is a tiny bit clunky. Okay.
So I don't think, oh, does it matter if we're not getting sound on that?
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll just say what this is. So this is the bit at the end of the film. You can see there is this terrible damage to it. And this is just saying that a print turned up in an archive in Brussels, which was from the original negative. So we had much better quality image to play with. And this coming up is my colleague Ben just talking about the different elements. So that one on top, you'll see in a sec, that's the negative that came from France. And then those are the other 2 elements. So we had to put them all together and scan them in a wet-gate printer. So it's a combination of photochemical processes, and then it all went to be digitally scanned. And then we did all the clever bits. So I'll stop that there because you can't hear the sound. And stop sharing. Here we are. So yeah, this damage was almost impossible to deal with. There was really nothing we could do with it before digital. So once that came in, we were able to scan it, and then go through and remove all the scratches and that weird sort of solarizing problem at the bottom at the end of the film. And it now looks pretty good.
It does. It looks glorious. I've got a question, if that's okay, from the audience. In fact, it's a few questions, but there's a very quick one at just at the beginning. Bryony, you might know this. What is the romantic lead toasting in the fire? Is one of the questions.
It's a kipper.
Yeah.
I knew you'd
It looks like an old shoe, doesn't it? And this is a sort of thing about the film stocks of the day. Things that were orange, photographed black. So if you get an actual orange, it will look black because of the type of film stock that they were using at this time. So it's a kipper, not an old boot leather.
Brilliant. And then the other part of this question is something I know that you'll be keen to talk about, Neil. It's about trains. The question is, was this filmed in the London Underground in the off hours, or did the production team get special permission to film during operating hours?
My understanding, and again, Bryony may have this at her fingertips, is that they weren't allowed or weren't able to film any actual train footage. That everything that they've got there is faked. In terms of the people in the screen. I'm sure obviously they were in the front of a train as it pulled in at the beginning, but they do seem to have had to do all the things that would be done now if you needed to film on the Underground, which is to make it happen outside the hours the Underground's actually working, huge amounts of permissions and goodness knows what else, take down all their own lights, all their own props, all their own people, etc. Have you got any more sort of detail on that, Bryony?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So they did it overnight. They brought in all their own extras. The film carriage that you see at the beginning with all the people in it is a set built out in Cricklewood. But yeah, they did have permission, and it took a long time to negotiate. But luckily, Anthony Asquith was quite persuasive, and of course, he was the son of a prime minister. And very well connected.
I think that.
And I don't know if I'm right about this, but again, I've always assumed that the long escalator that we see is the one that goes up from the Bakerloo line up to what the South Bank, actually.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So it's actually linked to BFI South Bank in that back in the day, and then they closed it, and now they've opened it again. That's the escalator you would take to go up from the Waterloo Bakerloo line platforms to get to the National Film Theatre.
That's right.
Unbelievably
right.
ironic. Great.
This question follows on a little bit from what you were saying. I don't know if you've got anything to add to what you've been saying already, but the question is about how complicated it was to do location shooting logistically in public areas and with the size of the cameras. So you talked a bit about the getting permissions and so forth, but would they have recreated the inside of a carriage, presumably?
Yeah, that was done as a set, but permissions always had to be sought from relevant authorities. In fact, London Transport Archives have all the old files and letters of the film company approaching them to film in certain places. So it's no coincidence that they go to film at Lotts Road Power Station, for example, because that is the power station that runs the London Underground. It powers the Underground, or it did at that time.
I wonder if they really had signs saying high tension in there.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt.
Very dangerous.
Yeah. The other thing that strikes me about talking about the difficulty of filming on location, one of the shots that just goes by you so quickly and you don't think about it, but just that question now has made me think about it. The shot at which Bill drops his parcel and it bounces down the escalator. Now they shoot that on the escalator. So in other words, they've had to set up the camera at the top of the escalator, had to start it moving. They have to shoot Bill. He then drops the parcel. They have to whip pan the parcel down and on down the escalator, all in one shot. Now that is an astonishing piece of directorial, I think, ambitious shooting, because that would have taken forever to set up. They'd have had to do it loads of times. He would have seen it in his head, and he would have thought the only way we're going to get the laugh, actually, and it's really only a laugh shot because he's just seen Joe and his girl going off into another tunnel. So that's what's made him shocked, and he's dropped his parcel. But for Asquith to know that's what he wanted, and then to be able to so confidently mount it, stage it, no matter what it cost, might take the whole night to get that whole sequence, that one sequence of them coming down the escalator at that point. I think that is extraordinary. And for its time, pretty unique, and pretty unique in this country, I should imagine, particularly.
Yeah, he was a very, very good director, and he had really studied hard. He'd been in Hollywood for 3 months. He had an elder sister, Elizabeth, who became the Princess Bibesco. She was very connected in the film world. She'd done a couple of parts of D.W. Griffiths when he was over in England doing Hearts of the World. And she was quite connected with Hollywood people. So she and Anthony went to Hollywood, and they stayed with Mary Pickford and Doug Fairbanks at Pickfair. And he spent 3 months immersing himself in filmmaking technique with Chaplin and with the Fairbankses. So he really, really studied all of those sort of very intricate things. And of course, he was a big film buff. He was one of the founders of the Film Society. So he was watching all those German films and really learning about lighting. He had a German lighting cameraman for this film, Carl Fischer, you know, as well as a regular cameraman. So no trouble was spared.
It really is remarkable and so striking, maybe if you're coming to this film for the first time, how wonderful the characterization is of as well. Like just in that first scene in the carriage, when you really get the measure of Bert, it's Bert, isn't it? Who's, you know, the way he's the kind of a guy who would just slip in without a care in someone's seat, and, you know, the sort of guy who'd read over your shoulder the newspaper, and you learn so much about him. But so his skill that you both describe so articulately, like why in that case is he, Asquith, maybe eclipsed for a lot of people in knowledge, in understanding, with compared with Alfred Hitchcock, for example? Why is he not more celebrated?
I think that's very
my
interesting.
answer to that, very briefly before I let Neil answer that, is that he worked in British film. Over to you, Neil.
No bitterness there.
I think you've got
British silent film curator.
I think you got to tease that out a bit, Bryony, if I may say so. Yeah, I mean, my answer was that I think the reception for this film, and again, I bow to Bryony on this one because I haven't seen the reviews, but from what I gather, is that it was considered a bit of an oddity and a bit too arty and a bit too Germanic, and not the kind of thing that audiences necessarily wanted to see. Now, I may be wrong about that, but Asquith seems to have come in for a fair bit of stick from not from the members of the Film Society at all, but seen as being too much of a filmmaker who drew attention to film. Now, I think it's fascinating that Asquith's main reputation now is as a great director of adaptations. So once sound comes in, it's as if he runs for cover to theatre, to literature, to all the various, you know, the Shaw plays that he did, the Wilde, all of those films for which he is rightly famous. After having created, to my mind, with Shooting Stars, with Underground, certainly with Cottage on Dartmoor, 3 quite astonishing original films. And I wonder whether it didn't break his spirit. Now, ultimately, I'm answering exactly the same answer as Bryony gave, because if he'd been doing this in Germany, he would have been held up as high as Murnau, maybe. But the fact he was doing it in Britain, and we didn't do that sort of thing, may have been the problem. But again, I would hand on to Bryony on that one.
Well, I would just add to that I've been reading all the newspapers, which are all beautifully digitized these days, of contemporary thoughts on it. And actually, I think it's the later writing that does Asquith down. So it's the sort of posh critics who say those things about him to a certain extent. And the thing about theatricality is just an old myth about British film in general. I mean, I defy anyone, you know, to find anything wrong with The Way to the Stars or The Winslow Boy. You know, these are fantastic films.
So for people, these are the sound films that some of the most celebrated sound films that he went on to make.
Absolutely, they just weren't big Hollywood action films. That's all, which is where Hitchcock is really famous from. And then we sort of project backwards to his silent film.
So should we return to the conversation we were starting to have, Neil, about the score and the detail of the score? And I always think my ear isn't particularly well educated, but it really felt to me like your score somehow manages to speak to the viewer in such a way as to make us appreciate a reference that you're making, and without necessarily being sure why in everybody's case. I mean, so you've got things like, is it the Blue the Blue Peter theme at the beginning? You've got a sailor, so you've got the Blue Peter theme, and or where did you get that hat, when Bert is admiring the hats and himself. But I think, like you were saying, you've got much more complex and rich references and quotes in there. And I think Bernard Herrmann, Vertigo, is it Vertigo directly, I heard in when Kate's mental state really starts to unravel. And I just thought, if you'd like, maybe we'd enjoy hearing from you more about your quotes and references. And how you...
I usually try and avoid it, particularly as a piano player, because if you're not careful, a whole load of baggage from outside the film comes dancing onto the screen when you play a piece of music people recognize from outside the film. And I've always felt that my job was actually to lock the auditorium doors and stop anything getting in that's not coming out of the screen. But when with the hat, there's just it just cries out. It's something about a hat, you know. So it's got to be, and almost certainly it's got to be, where did you get that hat? And I think that must have been going through Asquith's mind when he created that scene. The beginning was more of a, gosh, aren't I clever? Because I put in the sailor's hornpipe when the sailor stands up, and the British Grenadiers when the army guy stands up.
Yeah.
So the two of them take on each other. They have a little battle of the bands before Bert takes his seat, and that was mainly for my own, partially my own amusement, but also for my own confidence. Because I have to say, the first 10 minutes of any film is an utter and complete nightmare to me. Always. The opening title sequence music for this film does not reappear at any point in the movie. And that's because I kind of was standing or sitting in front of a blank sheet of paper screaming. And I just thought, right, if I don't get on with this now, I am not going to get this score finished on time. So I just went bleh with a piece of music, which would get me to the point where when Underground came up, I could do da-dum-bum, because I had planned that bit out, but I hadn't planned anything else. And then once we were going on from there, it was kind of all right, but I was still going, why am I doing this? It's all going to be terrible. The orchestra won't like it. People won't understand it. I've taken on too big a film. It's much bigger than Hitchcock. Oh my God, what a terrible idea. Oh, he stands up. I'll do a little thing there. That'll get us through that bit. And then by the time they get off the train, hopefully people will be enough into the film. They won't be listening to what the music's doing. So that was why those were there. And in almost all the cases after that, I had enough confidence not to directly quote, but to know where my sources were coming from when I was adding an idea to the film. So, for instance, the sequence where the two meet, where Joe and the girl meet, and I'm getting all these names wrong, but
Bill
and the girl. That's right.
No.
They meet in a very heightened underground escalator. We start with the escalator and we pull up, and there's this cathedral of light full of people. And I just thought, yeah, you know what? This is magical realism. This is a magical space where anything can happen. It's the boring old underground. But, you know, to be frank, how often did Anthony Asquith, the rich son of a prime minister, ever travel on the underground? So he's not going to give us the gritty reality of going into work first thing in the morning, because he probably never did. But he would be giving us a space in which we can absolutely believe that a porter come station bod in the underground can fall for somebody going past, and that could be how a romance begins. So I purposely heightened all the music for that. So you do get this kind of ba-ba-dum, bum-bum when you see up the escalator. And after that, everything's heightened. So the view of the Nell when she's telling her mum what happened, and we get that lovely mime of her saying, "We were on this," and then she falls apart in front of her mum. It's a lovely, lovely moment. It's very truthful, because it's about someone handling or dealing with emotions they don't know how to handle. So to be able to take that right down to almost nothing, a bit of piano and a bit of string background. And we were in kind of Mark Isham 1970s filming territory for that, because it felt real. And if I'd done anything more, I don't know, Rococo or more vintage or more anything else with it, it would have killed that scene stone dead. So I just tried to basically make the music creep discreetly along behind what we were watching. Now, the other thing that I did nick, but I don't know that it's a specific, it's a kind of generic idea, is what I think of as the crawling insects. When in that fantastic scene where she's realized just how she's been set up, and it just, but you know, has obviously just used her in a kind of horrible semi-rapey situation to set up what he's wanted to do. As her mind begins to turn, I put in 3 or 4 very kind of used ideas with music. One was the idea of the music slightly losing its way. So the music suddenly stops and becomes something else. She's walking around the room. She's looking at, she moves her plants. She's sitting with the sewing machine going. And again, that is central. That's what Robert McKee would call an image system. That's central to the whole film. You get loads of that time and time again. That's why, that's why they're in the music. But at the point where she really starts to lose it, I gave all of the strings what they call ad lib. They had to be ad lib pizzicato. So in other words, the top strings to begin with, and this was absolutely out of the Psycho playbook. Top strings first, then the next strings, then the violas, then the cellos, then the basses, so that by the end of it, you get this as if there are insects crawling all over the situation. It was her mind literally fragmenting into pieces until she suddenly goes junk, and the music literally went bump, bam, as a kind of like, and she gets up, runs to the door, opens the door, bang, yeah. There he is. So that was like being able to paint for a moment like Michelangelo, because all of those ideas I'd seen them elsewhere, I'd heard them elsewhere, I was able to use them one after the other in one fantastic sequence.
It was so effective, and it's so illuminating, I think, to hear you unpick in detail a particular scene. And I'd like to hear from Bryony, if you've got are there special scenes, special moments in the film that you'd like to tell us that you particularly enjoy? I think you mentioned, for example, the bar scene and the fight.
Oh, yeah, I love that scene.
But any scene that you'd like to talk about?
There's so many lovely scenes in the film, and so much really clever filmmaking, very intricate. And that's what I was saying I love about the score so much, is it really helps to bring that out. But the bar scene is very, very clever. So you've got the 2 men, Bill and Bert, meeting in the pub. It's obviously a regular venue. You've got the bored barmaid, who's one of the best things in silent cinema ever.
Vicky Pollard lived then, didn't she? Am I bothered?
Both. And then you've got this fight scene, and I think Bert throws a billiard ball at a mirror that's high up, So you get this fractured face, which is the sort of very Germanic expressionist kind of thing, you know, which to indicate the kind of fractured self, and the, you know, the presence of personality that's basically unhinged. And then you get the comedy moment where the billiard ball goes outside and drops into the street, and the woman who's holding an umbrella looks up, you know, it's raining billiard balls. So it's this sort of rather intense melodrama followed immediately by comedy. And he can pull that off. He's very incredibly confident, given he was only, what, 26 or something when he made this. Remarkable, really.
The two things I was most proud of with that scene. One was getting the orchestra to basically play like a pub band, which they took to like mother's milk. You wouldn't believe it. This is the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and they all, to a person, sort of stood up and mooned the audience musically. So the piano's all over the place. All the instruments are sliding around the notes. But the other is, and again, I nicked this, anybody who knows Miklos Rozsa's music for The Killers will have recognized it, was that I kept the piano riff coming as Bert staggered out of the pub and headed down the road and was planning how to get his revenge. But I then brought in the rest of the orchestra in a completely different key and a completely different piece. So you had one piece happening and then you have something else happening at the same time. And that's exactly what happens with The Killers. And again, being able to use something that I'd heard, but then make it work with a scene is just so lovely to be able to do.
There's a question hanging. Oh, there's two now in the chat. If I could just relay those to you. This one from Chris Midley says, I think Bryony mentioned that this was Anthony Asquith's second film and first as a solo director. I am amazed at the assurance of the direction and the emotional impact of the film. Did he have any other training filmmaking experience apart from spending time with the Pickfords? And I think, Bryony, you talked about his German expressionism, but is there anything else you'd like to say on that?
He was he just went and worked in film studios, so really from quite young he obviously was very interested in it, and he went with his sister to these so I think he must have been on the set when D.W. Griffiths was filming in England at the end of the war, and he's in Boadicea, I think, and if we ever get the film printed, we'll be able to see a diminutive Anthony Asquith in drag, which is probably significant, on a chariot in ancient Britain. So he clearly was haunting the studios. And going back to this sort of thing about him being an aristocrat, he was, I mean, for sure, but he was very much a socialist. He was very shy and gay, sort of, you know, which was difficult to be in those days openly. But he really liked to hang out with the ordinary people, and he did travel on the tube. And
take it all back.
He loved to hang out with the camera guys and the electricians and the crew. So he did sort of distance himself from his very posh background.
That's something. What you say there was obviously picked up by an anonymous message in the Q&A who said, did Asquith explain why he focused on working class lives in his early films? But so you talked about that, but then he goes on to say, or she, whoever, says, did he face any criticism as a result?
I'm sure he did, but I don't think people would have talked about that very openly. So it's possible. I mean, he did definitely distance himself from that kind of, you know, the high society. He also used it as well to his advantage, you know. But yeah, he really turned his back on all of that, I think. You know, his 50th birthday party, for example, you know, if you look in the papers, on his 50th birthday party, instead of, you know, going to the Ritz and drinking champagne, he has a tea party for all the poor kids in the village. where he's living. You know, it's that sort of guy he was.
Yeah.
He was very into that kind of post-war socialist project.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting question here that, and I think an early comment that's disappeared also alludes to it. And it's something we were talking about before this started. It says, to modern eyes, Bert is a massive sex pest. Did contemporary audiences think so too? And it's interesting. I felt when I was watching it how much the film chimes with our modern sense. For me, it chimed with modern sensibilities, in that clearly, Bert is a sex pest. Is it more than that? He's very dangerous. Yes, and I just. It really struck me that the scenes of him on the tube, for example, at the beginning, that paint his character, they're so relevant today when women are describing the everyday aggressions that they're subject to, and people are swapping ideas about how men can be allies of women, and that's exactly what Bill is, isn't he? He does a fantastic stepping in on the escalator to divert attention from Nell, and in a wonderfully elegant way that you'd be glad of today. So I suppose there's talk about that in response to the Q&A question, but for me, I'm also wondering is how important it is to you for a silent film to match with your own sensibilities or today's sensibilities, and how you manage when there's more of a clash. But just pick out of those things whichever you'd like to talk about.
Which of us are you asking?
Who would like to jump in?
I'll kick off with Bert the Sex Pest. I mean, yeah, he is. There's no two ways about it. Creepy, potentially violent, very horrible. But we're not introduced to him as an evil character. I think that's very clever in terms of the plotting of the film, is that Bert's narrative journey is actually from thwarted lover to killer. And that introduction of him shows him as not in any way a trustworthy man and a borderline sex pest who is bested by Nell, has to be said, although only bested by Nell because she's confident enough and smart enough, and one assumes in the mores of the day gorgeous enough to look after herself. But then from there on through, all of his motivations and all of his actions are malign. And I think it's very telling that in the scene in the alleyway, what's so smart about that is Nell's absolute understanding of her right to have the man she wants, not to put up with any of what she was getting from Bert. And I think that then going to, I know one who wouldn't, bang, there he is standing at the bus stop with his picnic under his arm, looking up the road, waiting for the bus and waiting for Nell to come. There's an implied take on two masculinities there from Asquith, the toxic masculinity and the non-toxic masculinity, who is then going to have to prove he's non-toxic. And that is, I think, really a very subtle and distinctive point to be making for the time, because under less sure hands, Bert could just have been introduced as an utter demonic figure who was going to lay waste left, right, and center. And he's absolutely not. He's introduced in to begin with as something of a loser who pushes his luck and gets it back in his face. But then the process of the rest of the film is why we keep watching, because we can't believe he's going to do what he's going to do next. And then we can't believe that he's going to force the girl who loves him to do something so horrible as to claim she's been attacked. So it's quite something, I think, in terms of sexual politics, to make the audience recognize those motivations and see them for what they are. And I think he makes it very clear where his sympathies and where his intentions lie as regards those relationships.
Bryony, what's your take on?
I totally agree with all of that. I mean, the thing is, Bert is very entitled. He wants Nell as the trophy girlfriend. She's more beautiful, more confident, and she's got this other suitor, so it's a sort of battle to win against the other alpha male. It's very modern, you know, and it could be happening right now if the underground wasn't closed. It's no different at all. I've met thousands of Berts. You know, they don't all go that far, but you know, that not very many women, I think, in this country who hasn't met a Bert at one time or another.
Mm-hmm. And we've got a few minutes left. Maybe, I mean, so the second part of that question for me was like, what happens for you, maybe as a viewer, archivist, curator, or as a musician, when you're presented with a film which isn't so easy to recognize as chiming with today's sensibilities? So the number of silent films we've seen where the woman, you know, doesn't really have the agency that we'd like, or the experience that we'd hope. Neil, could you pick up on that?
Yeah, it is a very, very big part of the job to, I've always thought it was a binary vision, to have a binary vision as an accompanist or as a composer of a silent film, which is that you try and keep in your view both how the film was intended to go over in the day it was made and what that audience was expecting, and what the audience now expects. And where possible, to smooth out the cracks and the bumps, if at all possible, but not by any means to excuse them. There are films that I simply can't play now. There's one I came across very recently that I used to absolutely adore, by Hitchcock, I have to say. And watching it after having 10 years away from it, and you know, with a view to accompanying it, I just found myself thinking, oh, good Lord, why didn't I see this for what it was before? And you do change. Things have changed. Thank God things have changed in terms of our attitudes to the on-screen representation of particularly male privilege. And now because I've always been a very instinctive pianist, and I link it back to being an actor when I was younger, that you can't do a performance you don't believe in. And if the script you're given is full of things that you wouldn't normally say, and in fact would go out of your way not to say, it's really hard to say them. This film for me doesn't, and this was the major reason I wanted to score it, it doesn't cross that line. There are plenty that do, but they were made at a time when things were different, when audiences expected something different. So where you can, I think you have to do the balancing act of allowing a film to speak with as much clarity as possible, but allow also for the fact that some of what it says to a modern audience will be unacceptable. And the music actually does have to recognize that as well. And I don't mean pull the rug from underneath the film, but certainly to highlight it, to draw it out.
Mm-hmm. And Bryony, you as a curator, have you got something to add to that?
Oh God, well, I mean, there are so many things in silent cinema that are difficult to put over to a modern audience. The sexism, the kind of Victorian storyline kind of thing you get in D.W. Griffiths with, you know, Lillian Gish always having to die at the end because somebody else has raped her and got her pregnant, you know, that kind of double standard stuff. Very difficult these days. But I think people understand that in terms of, you know, literary kind of references and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
These more modern stories, it's actually more difficult, I think. You know, you've really got to evaluate how these things come across. And then, of course, there's, you know, racial attitudes are very difficult and getting more and more difficult, you know, to deal with. You have to explain, you just have to explain and you know, people need to know that the past was like this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember a couple of years back, we had that fantastic Colleen Moore film, which we had in the gala. But there's an entire sequence where
Synthetic Sin,
where she does a whole blackface number. Not just blackface, but a whole dance in a kind of Piccaninny style. And it was very nearly a deal breaker as to whether or not we could show that film, quite rightly, because it's a horrendous moment. But then, if I remember rightly, Ali, you, and I think possibly Bryony as well, made the point in introducing the film that it was going to be there, and that it had to be recognised for what it was at the time without in any way vindicating it. That's an extreme moment. Usually it's just little bits of passing racism, passing particularly passing misogyny. I mean, it happens loads and loads and loads.
I'm trying to do the maths, but we had Body and Soul as our opening night film. I'm just thinking it's available for 48 hours, so there's probably a little bit of time for people still to see that. Oscar Michaud, a celebrated African-American filmmaker, and an all-black cast. And there's an interview, the Q&A after that with Wycliffe Gordon, the jazz musician who scored that film, is still available on YouTube. But maybe that's a good time to wrap up. We've reached our time. We've had our 45 minutes. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Bryony Dixon and to Neil Brand for your contribution to this Q&A, for joining in, and of course to Neil, from everybody, our heartfelt thanks for your score, and to Bryony, all the work you and the team at the BFI National Archive put into the restoration and made it possible for us to see here today. So there are just a couple of things to say. Both Bryony and Neil have very kindly agreed to go over to the virtual hub. There's no VIP separate area there. Everybody can chat amongst each other. And yes, I think Anthony Asquith, it would be right up his street, wouldn't it? And so if you've got any questions there for Bryony and Neil, or comments, tell them how much you loved everything, please put them in there. And then I also want to say that I hope everyone's going to join us tonight for our Friday night gala. And you should know the drill, you dress up. Neil is going to be providing the accompaniment for the Eagle. It's going to be fantastic. And then after that, you can head to the hub again for our silent film quiz at 8:45. And for that, you don't need a team. We'll put you in teams. And that's us wrapped up. Thank you very much.